I'm going to step through this code really quickly. So what's like the first thing that you see here that's like glaring obvious? You're like, whoa, this is a common pattern I see anywhere dealing with bundling or like shipping code of the web and encapsulation. It's like one of the first things we talked about. Do you guys see that? It is. There's an iffy, right? We have an iffy. Okay, so when I read iffies, contextually, what I want to see is where's the end and what's being passed into it, right? Because that's our state, that's our scope, that's all the data that's going to be used inside of this iffy. So like we know that we have an iffy, and what's passed into it is like the variable is called modules. We don't know what it looks like yet though. So let's just dive to the bottom. Oh yeah, that's right. I forget. Like we decorate this on purpose. So like the ending of these bar comments, that's where the end of the iffy is. Well, okay, so here's the end of our iffy, and we know the variable is called modules. So what do we have here? Inside of it is passed an array, right? So we have an array, and here's the end of the array. And what do we have here? An array of
iffies.
Oh, look at that. We have an array of iffies. Okay, cool. What do we have? It's our actual code, right? And we even use these decorations to try to make it easier for you to understand. So like if I was like just pop up console really quick, we have 0, 1, 2, 3 as our IDs. Well look, 0, 1, 2, and 3. So we get an array of iffies that is passed into this code right here. So we call this the Webpack bootstrap. Some people call it the runtime. I've heard people call it the manifest. I would not recommend thinking of a manifest like this because it confuses the whole PWA manifest and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's helpful. So I usually call it the runtime code because we use our internal APIs basically say chunk.hasRuntime. And this is what the runtime is. Okay? So let's understand exactly what this code does. We can just take it step by step. So if we're starting at the top, so we have a variable called install modules, and it's just equal to an object, right? And so what do we think this does? And the comment even helps us. It's a
cache.
It's a cache. It's a cache. It's a module cache. We don't really know how it works yet, but we're going to find out. Okay, and now we have, at the top level, a function called Webpack require. And so this is the require function. So let's just look at like this. I'm even going to zoom in. So contextually, we're only focusing on like just chunks at a time, right? So it's going to be like hyper large, super large. There we go. All right. So what is this code doing right here?
Checking whether or not a module exists in the cache.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. And you'll see that Webpack require takes a module ID parameter, right? So when this function's called, it's going to have some sort of ID passed to it. And that's where we get this. So basically, we're checking in the object, which of course we know right now has nothing in it. And then if it already exists, right, we're going to return that existing reference, right? And it's exports. .exports. It's exports. Don't confuse this with like the real module semantics. This is how we're making it work in the browser. So we have defined .exports kind of, and you'll see this here in a second. So .exports, so it's going to return a property called .exports from whatever is inside of this module cache. So now if we look down below, so of course that was an if statement. So if the module doesn't exist, that doesn't happen, right? So we can like forget it. Nothing's there yet, technically. So we see module equals installed modules, and then we actually put it in the cache at the exact same time as we declare is equal to the module ID that we passed, right? You know, from here. And then we just, I can't remember what the false means. I could go find out, but. And then there's a property called exports, which is an object, right? Okay. So that's a good start. So then I'll zoom out just for the sake of seeing the entire context here, just for this line. So now we actually need to call the code that we've required, right? Because we're still just inside this one require function. So we go and find that module, right? So we'll go pick it out. we'll do a dot call. We take the exports, and then we're also going to pass some other things inside of this IFI, because our modules are an array of IFIs. We'll pass the existing require function so that in case that module is using other modules. And then we're also going to provide whether default or named exports. Oh, that's right. L means the module's been loaded, right? So it's set to false by default, but then once it's actually executed, we're going to set it to true. And then we return the dot exports property from this synthetic module that we're creating. So that's what Webpack require does. So keep that in your mind. It takes an ID, and it actually calls the module and then returns any exports if it's available. So, and then we also have some other stuff here. Now, this is just, so ESM uses what's called live bindings. And that means that it's basically a feature supporting cyclical dependencies. So we have to kind of, it's typically, so natively it's going to be implemented inside the browser. This is the code required to be able to implement it in just like JavaScript land. So basically what we're doing is we're freezing the object so that it can't be reassigned or changed. That's why we wrap it in an object-defined property. If you need to support IE8, you need to have the object.defined property shim. You'd find that out pretty quickly. And then this is for CommonJS interop, right? So CommonJS technically doesn't have a default export. It has modules that export. And so what we do is we aligned with TypeScript and Babel to provide this pattern so it's consistent. And then there's some other like getting different, like also compatibility for non-harmony modules. But the meat and the potatoes that are super important is the Webpack require. So if we go down to the bottom of this code now, the last line that gets executed, what is happening here technically? So if we look, now that we know what Webpack require does, somebody tell me what that line does. Ignoring the .s. The Webpack require .s is not as important. But what's the ID getting passed to it?
The first module.
That's right. That's our entry point, executing. We're executing our entry point. The first module in the bundle itself as well. So if we look at the IFI, we know now, so like modules is actually, like modules that gets called. We're calling this function here, which is an IFI. We pass this information in, which is like scope and state, and then the require function. And now what's happening is that it's calling it on the other things. So like you can kind of see how your code resembles the user lane code. Like if I compared the index up next to it, it's not quite the same, but you can kind of see, right? Because we're pulling out the nav, the footer, the button, the styles, and we try to give it some sort of understandable name. And you can see here, like that's where we're pulling it. And since they're different modules in different locations, we actually have different IDs. So like Webpack require 1 is just jumping down here and calling this. And in the same way, like require 2, Webpack require 4. So like how it works is that Webpack require is just replacing these import statements, the require statements, to something that actually works in the browser, execute and behaves the same in the right order. Does that make sense so far? Do you have any questions? I know this code at first, like the generated code can be a little intimidating, like because it's like, oh, this is only 5 files and I have this ginormous, like, what is this? And I get some people who like just try it for the first time, they're scoffing. They're like, this is way bigger than my original code. But of course, like thousands of modules, tens of thousands of modules, much more optimized. So this is really the minimum overhead that you incur from using Webpack. But everything is done at build time, right? So like this is the only runtime code that exists from Webpack. Everything else is just a product of the build. But yeah, any other questions or anything? I would always like recommend like this is a great place to like if you just want to learn how things are working, or you want some, it's nice even debugging to set mode none, because you can actually see, we even identify like, hey, this is a Harmony import. Hey, this is a default export. Hey, this is a Harmony binding because we're binding a function, right? And so it shows. Like it shows you all this just in comments. We can identify that. And it's kind of like it's using the same heuristics that we use to do tree shaking.